of feel out whether this person was going to do what they said they were going to do. The disadvantage is that it's only possible to speak to so many people in a given day. It's only possible to get your message out in a given day. What if people aren't home? What hours do you visit them? Yeah, you might see them on the way to church. You might see them in the park. You might see them on the street. But there's a limit to how much one person can go door to door. The technology of social reform gave them an advantage. And the ward bosses were not manning the phones and manning the telegraph. They clung to their in-person door-to-door styles. Even people like Frank Hague in Jersey City, he would show up. He would show up at funerals. He would show up at your door on voting day and make sure that either he or one of his, what do they call him? Like, not a consigliere, but like someone who's like one of his like number two right-hand man, they would show up and deliver the vote. And so this is a fascinating contrast in the theme of technology. Another thing to look for, which is really quite exciting in Chapter 6, is the rise of formal publications. We have had newspapers from the get-go. From the beginning of urban America to this point, there are obviously newspapers being published. What makes this so exciting is that McClure's magazine, which appeals to women readers, it's very cheap. You can get it delivered to your house. The newspaper, the New York Journal, and the rival, the New York World, these are getting articles out there. These are venues for people to write think pieces, editorials, critiques, and it kind of raises the stature of publications in the United States. It used to be that a lot of these rags and magazines and were like National Enquirer style, just whatever they could do to sell a penny paper, very cheap and in both content and price. These magazines with beautiful photographs being published, newspapers with editorials and research going into them, they kind of raise the bar. They still play tricks to sell, but they're generally a venue for people to write thoughtful articles on social reform. Another detail, which we won't get into tonight too much, but the rivalry between the New York Journal newspaper and the New York World was quite intense. Joseph Pulitzer hated William Randolph Hearst, and the feeling was mutual. And the two men jockeyed for readership, as the New York Times was considered a super conservative, quiet, stately paper, and these two are like duking it out for readers at the turn of the 20th century, excuse me. So one of the most famous names of this era of publications is a man named Lincoln Steffens, and he was one of the famous muckrakers. So if you haven't had this in one of your American history classes, or if it's been a while, muckraking in urban America is a process of getting into the dirt, pulling back the curtain, and being willing to go into the muck, and even raking it around a little bit and stirring up the dirty secrets of politicians, stirring up the dirty secrets of the political machines with your rake. And so it's a very evocative term. The cartoonist who we screened in class, the one in the video, Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T, when Thomas Nast released his cartoons of Boss Tweed, he was a muckraker. He was stirring the pot. That's the phrase we now hear. Who's stirring the pot? Lincoln Steffens was a muckraker, and his series of articles in 1904, they were called The Shame of the Cities. They were published, and this is one of those classic moments in urban America, which we will find later in the course in a few weeks. We will find that Americans like to, quote, discover poverty. This is something strange. It's a game we play in the United States, where every 20 to 30 years or so, we have these shocking exposés on, quote, how the other half lives, the title of another famous muckraking piece by Jacob Riis. And people are reading and seeing photographs of the poor and realizing, wow, there are people, thousands and thousands of people in the United States who live like this. And they get moved to contribute and to call for reforms and to call for aid. And so this idea that we live blissfully unaware of poverty until it kind of like reaches up and grabs us. And This is something that we do in the United States. I'm not sure how this plays out in other nations, but here in the U.S., specifically in the cities where poverty is more visible because people are on the streets, people are homeless, we have the game of discovering poverty. And so Lincoln Steffens is pretty much the first big moment where we do this, and his articles were called The Shame of the Cities. Very evocative title. Let's continue talking about the women of social reform. One of the most successful impulses of social reform was temperance. And I'm trying to remember if I let you go on these stairs in class last week. Either because it's really interesting to see, or because maybe a couple of you are absent. So let's kind of go on the stairs. This is a piece, it's called The Drunkard's Progress. It was the kind of visual released and circulated by the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. Their goal is to get men to stop drinking alcohol, or at least to stop drinking as much. And their argument was that as men proceed through the steps of drinking with a friend, having maybe one too many glasses, starting to drink at lunch, being drunk and riotous, they finally reach the point where their life descends out of control and they go down the stairs towards poverty and disease, and finally they end up with desperation and crime and suicide, which is the last image of the guy. And you're like, wow, all that from having a glass of wine? Yeah, that's the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. It's a very successful campaign, so successful that they begin in 1874, and by 1911, they have recruited over 200,000 members. They are signed up, they are going to meetings, they're distributing literature, and it became a very empowering thing for women to do to fight back at what they saw as a society that wasn't meeting their needs. By getting liquor out of a particular town, they thought they could clean it up and have more peaceful lives where the husbands came home on time, the husbands came home sober, lower instances of spousal abuse or violence. These sorts of things were goals of the WCTU. And they made inroads into some of the biggest cities in urban America. The textbook notes on page 145 that Chicago was about one half dry in the outskirts parts, not in the downtown. You're not going to make downtown Chicago dry. But they got big neighborhoods on the outskirts of Chicago to be declared dry by 1908. And that means you can't get your booze there. You have to take the elevated train down to the downtown to get your drinks, which is like super annoying, right? Just kidding. So this is part of the reform impulse. It's taking away the liquor. The other thing that is fascinating, as we will follow this story from Helen Jewett and the sensationalism of that story of the prostitute murdered that we used for the midterm, into this, and then finally we'll follow this into a dramatic story about Times Square prostitution in the 1970s. We have this turn in the discussion of prostitution. It is fueled by social scientists. It is fueled by WCTU women. They say that prostitution is not some sort of scourge or some sort of terrible stain on the women themselves, but rather on society. And they begin to speak of women who are forced into lives of prostitutions, or who fall into lives of prostitution as victims. And the idea of prostitutes as victimized female labor changes the whole conversation about prostitution. Rather than shunning the women, they invited them in to try to get them educated and employed in non-prostitutional jobs that would save the women as victims rather than shun them as harlots. It's a really big change. Look for that in chapter 6 as well. Now, schools are a big venue for social reform and also a big agent of reform. Many teachers were female. Many teachers are participating in temperance movements, trying to get rid of the booze. They're participating in publishing, in conferences, and this is still true today in a lot of ways. There's an echo of this in our modern school movement, in our modern school system. We also have a trend that is related that is called by the textbook factory-like, where you have schools adopting a lot of centralization and standardization. This has a dark side for those of you who hate standardized tests, or for those of you who are about to go on to teaching careers where you're going to be handed a curriculum and you have to follow the curriculum for some reason, some sort of core, some sort of method. You need to follow the rules because of this trend. So it allowed for a rising tide to lift a lot of boats. Using that phrase, the question is, does a rising tide lift all boats? But it also allowed for some of the creativity and individuality of teaching to be drowned, so to speak. Central policy out of the main office, central policy out of the district, out of the principal's office. This is something that you'll know very well if you don't know it yet. And the rise of standardized curriculum, which has its blessing and its curse aspects. It does allow for perhaps schools that weren't properly giving their students enough rigorous curriculum to be lifted up, but then it stifles creativity, as I'm sure you can understand. Settlement houses, I did mention last week, and settlement houses are one of those focal points of social reform. The Great Toynbee Hall in England was visited by some of the famous women who founded the settlement houses in America, most famously Jane Addams, who leads Hull House out of Chicago. So look for that in Chapter 6 and understand that it really was quite a movement. It is far more than Jane Addams. We had 74 settlement houses in 1897, and by 1910, as you see here, 400. So this is an exponential level of growth. We're really seeing this method of housing people, educating them, training them, giving them proper nutrition, giving them exercise. We're seeing this method sweep the nation from Seattle to San Diego to Miami to Portland, Maine. We have a lot of, or Portsmouth, whatever, to Maine. We have these settlement houses sweeping the country. We also had, through settlement houses, through schools, and through the WCTU, we have opportunity for women's careers. The idea that you would be a woman reformer was very alive and well in the first half of this course, all the way through the Revolution, all the way through the early 1800s. There are many women who are the reformers, the leaders, the purifiers, but they do not do so on a career track. With the rise of social reform, many women are able to get salaries, they are able to get positions and promotions, they are able to become principals and even city leaders, to a lesser extent mayors. But this is a really exciting trend for women's careers. Last but not least, I want to close out this particular video with reform not for the family, not for voting and political machines, but for the city as a whole. And this is something that is intimately related to everything we've done so far. People who thought cities needed to be cleaned up at the voting booth also thought cities needed to be cleaned up aesthetically. And not to get all like midterm on you, but all that stuff from the White City and the work of Daniel Burnham really put the cherry on top of this City Beautiful Sunday. The City Beautiful movement was a movement of planning and a movement of engineering, and it reaches a crescendo in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and begins to sweep the nation as city leaders saw how beautiful a city could be. Many of them visited the Chicago World's Fair, and they themselves brought back a vision to create their own City Beautiful. So the phrase City Beautiful is something that people wrote about and talked about when they described the changes they wanted to make to their city. So let's take a look. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is something that you generally think about as a labor tragedy. But what I want you to understand in regard to planning an engineering city is the true tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It was taking place in a building called the Asch Building, ASCH. And the Asch Building was a recently completed, relatively beautiful and state-of-the-art building at the turn of the 20th century. This